So hello everybody, welcome to a Coffee and Concepts. I have my coffee, I don't know if you have, but I also have concepts. So I come armed with both. And as I'm trying to do this year is really connecting Coffee and Concepts with the Power seminars, kind of getting everything working together. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the things we looked at 2 weeks ago with the 4 discourses. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at 2 of them in relation to religion and in relation to power theology, and then say open it up for some discussion. I'm basically assuming that you were at the seminar a couple of weeks ago, otherwise this might not make any sense. I'll also put the 4 discourses up here on the screen so we can look at them as I talk. I don't know if that's, yes, there we go. I'm going to move all of your pretty faces somewhere else so I can see. Do that. Okay, so what I want to do, I'll go over them very briefly again. Lacan talks about 4 discourses. He's trying to, like, you can do lots of things with these, but at a very basic level, one can say that he is going, what is it that is unique about psychoanalytic discourse? Whenever you are in the clinic, what is happening? And he's distinguishing that from other forms of language and intercommunication. But these are also 4 central discourses that are that really show the connection between discourse, desire, and dividedness. There you go. There's like a sermon for you. 3 points all with the same letter. So discourse, desire, dividedness. So what you see is the very first word is the master's discourse. When you think about how are we integrated into language, how do we become speaking beings? And one way of thinking about it is, well, there has to be a first word, but there can't be a first word because language requires 2 words. You can't have language that just has 1 word, right? Language has to have, it's a signification. 1 word signifies another, signifies another. So the most basic language you could have, I guess, is like computer code, 1s and 0s. So the first word is a type of negation, a type of no that generates another word. It generates interpretation. So, you know, in very crude psychoanalytic terms, the first no is no, you can't have your mother, right? The incest taboo. You have to separate. That's the first word, the no. And then there is the what does that mean? The attempt to interpret it. And of course, if you think about this in terms of the Oedipus complex, the no generates a desire to transgress the no. So there's a no, then the desire to transgress the no begins to come up. And this is kind of the very beginning. And I use the story of Adam and Eve in this, you know, you cannot eat of the fruit. No. So that's the prohibition, which generates the desire to eat the fruit. Oh, if we eat this fruit, we will be like God. And then that causes all sorts of problems. So master's discourse is a way of seeing how kind of language begins when we experience this type of no, and we try to interpret it, and it creates a certain level of desire. So on the symbols in front of you, S1 is the master signifier, which here is the no. S2 is the generation of a second signifier. That's the chain of signifiers. That's kind of like now you have to try to, you know, language is born and tries to make sense of the master signifier. But it's the same with like words like democracy and God. Whenever you use the word God, it's a type of master signifier, a very self-knowing master signifier. I mean, theologians always talk about like God as in a sense as a signifier that can't be signified. It's a signifier that every time you try to grasp what God is, you're missing it, you're losing it. So it generates a whole type of discourse. It generates all of this knowledge, but the knowledge never nails down what God means. It kind of like creates a shape, but it can never nail it down. And then A signals this unconscious desire that's generated. And finally, the barred subject, which is the idea of a divided subject, a subject who is not at one with themselves. So you could say that the master says the father in this example, the father who says to the child, you cannot have your mother, is really a divided subject, is pathetic, just like us, but we don't really know that. We do experience the parent as this strong figure. Right. Very quickly, the discourse of the university, which is at the other side of this, is a type of discourse in which we are now addressed by knowledge. Maybe your parents are trying to tell you how to live in the world, operate, what you should do. So culture, the whole point of knowledge is directed at your desire to help you make sense of and domesticate your desire, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to brush over that very quickly, but that generates and that creates a divided subject. But then, so we've got those two, the master's discourse and the university discourse. The master's discourse is a command discourse, it's a demand. The university discourse is the professor, the one who tells you who you should vote for, what you should do, how you should think. And beneath the professor is S1, which is a master. You know, usually, sadly, experts are... behind experts is money and power, and basically the status quo. And then Lacan has these two inverse discourses, and these are the more interesting ones, the Hysteric and the Analyst. If you said basically the master's discourse creates desire and the university discourse creates dividedness, the divided subject, in the Hysteric and the Analyst, desire and dividedness become the primary forces. So what's created in these former two discourses now are given primary status. Okay, so I'm going to give you two examples. I was thinking about this today. I'm going like Jesus and Christ, right? I'm going to talk about Jesus as the Analyst and Christ as the Hysteric. Let's see if this works. I'm playing with these themes to try to really get a grip on what the practice of parotheology is. And we're going to see if this works. I'm also going to say that decentering practices are a type of analyst discourse, and transformance art is a type of hysterics discourse. Okay, so why do I think Jesus is, you could say Jesus has a type of analyst discourse? I mean, very briefly, I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, is in some respects, you can see that through the parabolic discourse that you find in the Gospels, you actually find that the type of discourse that Jesus was engaging in was a powerless discourse that reflected back the desires of people onto themselves, the good things and the bad things, all the repressed stuff, right? Through a parable or through a certain very interpersonal conversation, people saw an aspect of themselves and their own dividedness and their own desires. And you could almost say that although we try to make the Gospels into a type of university discourse, sometimes we're like, there's a certain set of criteria in which to be saved, for example. Like, there's a certain set of things you can do, and you can work it out what you would have to believe in order to, say, be saved. In actual fact, if you read the Gospels, it seems like Jesus said something different to everybody, right? It was like he didn't seem to have a standard kind of like university discourse. Here's the 4 points. It just very much feels like Jesus was an expert at confronting you with your own truth, and with that idea that you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free, that you encounter yourself through the encounter with Jesus. And this is one of the things. Now, it wasn't the only thing he was doing at all, but when you look at the kind of discourse of Jesus, I think this parabolic discourse feels a lot like the analyst discourse. And the reason why I say that decentering practices like the Last Supper, the Evangelism Project, the Omega Course, and what's the other one? Is that only 3? I don't know. But the decentering practices are a type of analyst discourse is because when you go to, say, atheism for Lent, you are a divided subject. you're at some level, not everybody, but at some level, people are between theism and atheism. They feel a kind of rupture in themselves. So say you're the one who's being addressed, the barred S, if you look at the Analyst discourse, you're the barred S, you're the divided subject, and you're desirous, right? You enter into these practices and you encounter directly that dividedness. You encounter directly your split between theism and atheism and have to try to navigate that. And in some way encounter you, your own desire and your own split. Like it's difficult because the analyst discourse in proper psychoanalysis, you don't get any content. The analyst mostly just sits there. You project onto the analyst, and the analyst, hopefully skillfully, draws out how you're projecting things onto the analyst, how you're transferring relationships from the past onto that. And through the analyst's minimal engagement, you kind of come to see yourself and your desire and your own dividedness. With decentering practices, there's lots of content. So it is very different from the clinic, very different in that way. But we're talking theology here, and we're also talking not individuals, right? I'm talking about the nature of what it means to be human, to be a subject. So whenever you do atheism for Lent, you are experiencing something fundamental about the conflict and dividedness between theism and atheism. And you're kind of like coming to see that. In the same thing with the Omega Course, which is all about the dividedness in Christianity, i.e., you're confronted with liberal views, conservative views on issues. You start to see that Christianity is not a monolithic discourse, but it's fragmented, it's divided, and you find yourself enjoying that dividedness. With the Last Supper, it's the same thing. You go to the Last Supper and you begin to, through a series of Last Supper events, begin to crack your own monolithic positions. You know, you start to feel what you already intuitively probably do because you're already going to the Last Supper. You start to encounter your own dividedness. You see yourself through the eyes of the person who's the guest of the Last Supper, and you gradually come to terms with that type of dividedness that you are. So there's something about the decentering practices that I think is connected to the analyst discourse. And if I was having people doing decentering practices, I would basically use that as an example. Like, are the people encountering their own dividedness? Are they encountering their own divided desire? So I get one concrete example. I had a guy years ago did the Atheism for Lent. He was a missionary in Tajikistan, and he was about to give up on faith entirely. And then he did Atheism for Lent, and he said the really paradoxical thing was that he found himself more deeply committed to his faith in a very freeing way, precisely when he thought it was going to be the opposite. He thought Atheism for Lent was going to be his swan song because he already wanted to leave. But it was basically, he had these conflictual ideas, desires. He had an atheism within him that he wasn't able to express properly. When he was able to confront his atheism and make space for his atheism and his theism, so make space for both parts of those dimensions in his life, he came out feeling kind of really liberated. And kind of went off. Now he works in CERN, interestingly, doing very interesting things. But that's an example of kind of like, there was a repressed atheism in him as a missionary, and it was coming out in very unhealthy ways, even aggressive ways. But Atheism for Lent allowed him to experience and to make peace with a conversation between his theism and atheism in a way that was helpful to him. Okay, one more thing and then open it up. Transformance art and the hysteric. I kind of see this as God being the barred subject. So in the hysterics discourse, we are addressed by a divided subject. So when I say Jesus was the analyst and Christ is the hysteric, I'm thinking Christ on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Christ the divided subject is addressing God, the undivided subject, God, kind of whatever, why have you forsaken me? And then, see if this can work, but then it generates a new community. So the community of believers, S2, a new community of knowledge, a new community of believers. And A, underneath this is desire. You could say, if you want to draw an arrow between S1 and A, you could say that, the desire of God is to be addressed by a divided God, or that the very core of religion, the very desire and animating desire of religion is ultimately to encounter this divide. So in Transformance Art, we're constantly confronting a type of God in which doubt, ambiguity, and complexity is interwoven into the very concept of God. And that is expressed in the liturgical structure itself, so that you encounter your own, well, in this, it basically challenges our own kind of like orthodoxies, it challenges our own kind of like master discourses. And it kind of brings to light our own doubts and our own unknowing. So we're going to spend more time on this over the next few months, but broadly speaking, Jesus the Analyst, decentering practices, a type of analyst discourse, Christ the Hysteric, and pyrotheology, Transformance Art, as a type of liturgy of hysteria in which you encounter the divided God, and that hopefully helps us feel more at peace with our own dividedness. Right, let's go for it. Anybody want to open up and ask any questions or ask for clarifications or take us in a different direction?
An event like Wake, how would you situate that in these discourses, like Wake or Spark?
That's very good. Yeah, I guess, yeah, Wake, everything the reason why I like these four discourses is I just think that the Hysterics and the Analyst discourse both, when it comes to what I'm trying to do, reflect something of the practice. So, if you pushed it, I would go like, well, Wake, I guess, is like a type of Hysterics discourse. It's a type of wanting people to enter into and experience the type of dividedness of the absolute, the death of God. The death of God as master signifier. Well, maybe I'd say that. Well, in one sense, whenever it's a wake, the wake is a funeral. The funeral is to a kind of like a undivided God.
Okay, I think that sets you up for this question that I want to ask then. That emphasis on the discourse of the Hysteric and the discourse of the Analyst, is that because you feel that those are repressed in our culture and that master and university are overemphasized? Or is there something inherently evil about the university discourse?
I say I would kind of go like, you can't have desire and dividedness without language, without the master and university. So yeah, for me, it's almost like to be human is to be birthed into this excessive desire and this experience of dividedness. And the only problem is if that does not get expressed, that does not have a place to sit, if you know what I mean. Do you want to come back to me on that?
Yeah, so is it that you have the sense that the Hysteric and the Analyst discourses are unexpressed in our culture and pyrotheology is giving an outlet for them?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Like there's places where they are, obviously expressed, maybe like for individuals, it might be a psychoanalysis or whatever. But yeah, it's almost saying that religiously speaking, especially, is like we need spaces where we encounter our desire and where it's funny, the Hysterics discourse is different. So the problem is I sometimes I feel like I'm being very unorthodox in how I'm using this, because the Hysterics discourse in some sense is the discourse of someone saying what do I want? Do you love me? Like that's the step. So the divided subject says to their partner, do you love me? And then the partner has to say, yes, I love you because X, Y, and Z. So S1 creates S2, lots of reasons. And this questioning comes from an unconscious desire. So that's what it kind of means. But
yeah, there's something like wake seems like a university discourse, almost like you or Adam and your guests are standing in as the field of knowledge, and we're coming there with a desire to learn more. So it feels like there is it. So are you trying to are you enacting a bait and switch? Like you bring people there with that anticipation, and then you enact a different discourse?
That's very good. Yeah, you are right. By the way, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see your faces as you're talking. Wake is, I would hate to say it, you're right, isn't probably more of a university discourse. At least during the day, it's all seminars. It's like whenever Lacan gave the seminar on the 4 discourses, it's a university discourse. He's describing it. He's doing it in a teaching way. And if anything, the problem is I'm always wary of creating a type of transformance art experience at Wake exclusively, like a type of very artistic experience, because they're very hard to create. They're very hard to go into a very experiential place and do that. But I want a certain amount of that. But yeah, I suppose in one sense, it's probably fair to say at least half of Wake is a university discourse with speakers just giving information.
Okay. Yeah, and that's just kind of, I'm looking for, is there like a time and place for each of the discourses? And within the pyrotheology, would all 4 of them have an expression? Or is it like that really, it's the hysteric and the analyst that pyrotheology is looking for? And you've already talked about it. That's just the intent.
No, well, thanks. No, that's great. And the truth is, what I would probably say is this is, when we're actually doing a transformance art event, whether it's at Wake or whether it was with Icon, that is primarily an hysterics discourse, in that I'm not lecturing or speaking very much. And if I speak at all, I'm going to give a parable. I'm going to give something like that. But whenever you're doing something like Wake, it's kind of, or teaching like on the Patreon, this is all much more of a type of university discourse, and they all have their place. And so that's good. Anybody else want to jump in?
Hey, Pete, it's Tim. I think I understand the theory of the 4 discourses. I think you've done a great job explaining them, and there's been some feedback, and this isn't the first exposure I think we've had to these concepts. I guess what I'm trying to wonder, is they all kind of work together. I mean, is there any control factor over these discourses? In other words, if we find ourselves in a master discourse situation and we're the recipient, but we don't want to be in that. Practically, can we move in and out of it? Can a discourse happen that isn't cooperating with the recipient at that level? Somebody wants to do master, but I want to do hysteric. Or I think I understand it enough to know how to operate that. I'd be more comfortable perhaps with that, or not. But I've grown up very much in an environment of a master discourse. I mean, my parents, the church history was very much like that. And then it seems like there is a maturation of discourse involvement. You move to the university, and then whether or not the hysteric is the ultimate pinnacle of every discourse that's healthy, these are some of my ruminations. And I guess I would like to hear more about that. I mean, it's wonderful to understand what may be happening. Is there a control factor on anybody's part in these discourses? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. And I'll say a few words. Somebody else might want to say something about that. If I'm hearing you right, something that Adorno used to talk about is that in society, whether we protest against something or not, any response is a kind of involvement. We're interpolated into it. And so the only way to escape is to somehow completely remove your investment in a certain ideology. It's like, so even removing even your protest against it, you kind of, and Shizak is similar to that, is it, I think he says in society, there's a certain point at which to escape a type of ideology is somehow to just completely live as though it didn't exist, live as though it didn't have any weight in your life. I'm not sure if that's kind of the direction you're going with this, but I'm trying to think of a good example. Like Shizak talks about the "I would rather not" as an ethical thing, where Rosa Parks, who just kind of like, or Mother Teresa are good examples of people who just ignored. Mother Teresa ignored the caste system. It just acted as if it didn't exist and wasn't interpolated into it, and also didn't protest against it, just acted like it didn't exist. And that was more traumatizing to the system than active rebellion against it.
Well, if I could just follow up, I guess, I think there are a couple of these, especially the hysteric and analysts, that would find a discomfort amongst the person with whom that is happening, which is sort of the design of what you're talking about with wake and icon events. Those are intentionally designed to be somewhat unraveling and to create that environment. So I'm thinking in a culture like ours, fewer people I would think would be comfortable finding themselves in the hysteric or analyst discourse, because I guess we're more used to the master university thing, and yet they may not be as productive for what pyrotheology is trying to pursue. So to kind of like force the discourse, if you will, force the model, is that healthy? Is that something we should strive for? Is it just something that should happen more naturally? I guess something like that.
Nicole, did you want to jump in on that, by the way, or were you about to speak?
I was. I think understanding Tim's question better, it may not be as relevant, but sometimes for me, when I'm trying to understand a concept like this, I'll take it down to a very fundamental level and then build back up. And the other day I was talking about just a situation I have at work where I'm supposed to be transferring leadership of some projects to another person. And that person most certainly wants to put me in a master's discourse situation where I literally said like, hey, just checking to make sure all this stuff's done because I have a meeting about it coming up. And she's like, well, you didn't specifically ask me to do X, Y, and Z. And I had to write her back a very tactful email and check it with my boss that said like, you are the project manager. I am not going to give you step-by-step directions on how to do that. And so that was a situation where I had to be and I had tried more subtle with her before, like on the phone and just like, girl, you got this. You don't need to check with me, and that wasn't working. And so I had to be more direct and say, as the project manager, I'm not going to be sending you reminders and I'm not going to tell you step-by-step what to do. You got this. You're very competent. You'll be able to do it. The only reason I asked is I had a meeting coming up, so like that's one example. And then when you talk about the parent-child, I think a lot about the rites of passage, especially because I believe higher ed is a rite of passage. We treat it as one in the US anyway. And so I've studied a lot about rites of passage. And I think whenever you're trying to maybe disrupt the scenario between two people, I almost think there almost needs to be a break. Like when I think of rites of passage, there's always a going away and coming back. And that, for example, with the parent and child, that signals to both the parent and the child that there is a break in what was, and that there's a new paradigm when that person comes back. And so I wonder if that may be part of it too. That's all I had to jump in.
Thank you. Very good. Yeah, there's lots of things there. What you mentioned about this colleague, Lacan's very much, says with something that I think we all know is pretty true. Sometimes is we often want a master. We want someone to tell us what to do, and we want someone to give us guidance. So master university discourse is what we often want. And the analyst and the hysterics discourse are kind of ways of trying to help people, I guess, existentially become more individual, to kind of like, so the analyst discourse, you confront your own desire. So you have to confront what you want instead of getting someone else tell you what you want. Or, you know, like a lot of people I know do things like tarot because they want someone to tell them what to do, you know, or you go to get your palm read or whatever. It's like, we want someone, or look in the Bible to find an answer, whatever it is. It's like some external authority to tell us what to do. And the analyst discourse confronts you with your own desire, and you kind of have to navigate it yourself. And then the hysterics discourse is the discourse in which we question authority and we, you know, think for ourselves. So I guess, yeah, whenever you talk like that, is that the hysteric and the analyst discourse, I guess, are attempts to prevent us from falling back into exactly that, of wanting a new master, a new something to tell us what to do and how to do it.
So this really turns theology or perception of God on its head, because you're saying now, based on Christ figure being the broken, the divided subject, that's God's not a master, he's a divided subject, and he is therefore the hysteric, if you want to call him the hysteric God. Right?
Yeah, I think in fact, that's a possible title for the book I'm writing at the moment, as I'm looking at kind of hystericizing God, or the hysterical God, or the unknowing God is one, but I like the hysterical God. I think it's quite a good title, because and the idea is that, yeah, and you're exactly right, it turns theology on its head, because God is the ultimate big other to tell us what to do and how to do it. It's for in religion, like often it's like we look to God to tell us, you know, what should we do? And this theology, which I think is very true to Christianity, this theology confronts you with yourself and says that you are condemned to freedom. You have to decide in fear and trembling how to act. And that is a theological position. Like that's you know, yeah, that's that. So it kind of turns God on his head.
So, oh, I could wait a moment.
Oh, by the way, another thing we did yesterday, which worked really well, is you can just jump in anytime, but if you want, stick up your hand as well, because I can see that and then I can call you in. So I saw William pop up first, and then, so William, do you want to jump in, and then Kev?
Yeah, I'm sorry I keep coming back to this theme, but it's something that's really bugging me, is that we seem to be talking about these discourses on an intellectual level, or perhaps an emotional level, as we talk to one another, as we try to conceive of God, conceive of and I just want to keep coming back to this as God as event, and how the discourses impact upon our activity, upon our embodiment of love, are practical and actionable, and whether these four discourses are appropriate in that context. Because it's good to give examples which are intellectual and emotional. I'm just wondering if there's any which, in terms of a practical discourse, an activity discourse, a miraculous discourse, if you like.
Okay, that's great. I'll give you one example and tell me if this is what you mean, or if this is too abstract. I'm going like if you take this idea, then in a church environment, this means that if a church is looking at how to, say, you know, do some good in the local community, the idea with the practical outcome would be like, listen, whatever we decide, it's on us. We don't know exactly how it's going to work out. We are responsible for the act. It could screw up. Like, in other words, there's no guarantee from God. It's not like you pray and we believe God wants us to do X, Y, and Z. It's almost like we're prayed and we're sensitive and we're going to act, but that act is our responsibility. Now, is that a practical outworking, or is that different from what you mean? Because I like
I think that is true. And just to reflect that back a bit, is you don't tell people how to ride a bike. You know, there's no amount of words that's going to describe the process of learning how to ride a bike. You get on the bike and maybe you're supported a little bit, you know, by the parent or whoever. but you get on the bike and you go forward and you learn how to ride the pedals, how to move the steering wheel, and that to me is a discourse in and of itself. It may not be an intellectual exercise, but it certainly is a learning and a process exercise where you're learning about gravity, you're learning about castering, you're learning about all sorts of things, and that to me is a discourse. And it's the same way with practical expressions of love and God as events, is that as you get on and do them, you learn far more about them than if you try and conceptualize and turn them into language.
Yeah, yes, no, that's very good. And I think, and it's very close to, what Tillich talks about. It's going like that basically we always have to act with it, basically in the cloud of unknown, but we have to always act with fear and trembling and not quite knowing what we're doing or how we're doing it. But it's the very courage to act without knowing that is the act. So in some respects, I think theologically speaking, the four discourses can remind us or give us a notion of God that is not the kind of like, I can abdicate my responsibility, I'm just doing what God said, to go and like, I'm doing what I think is right, but in fear and trembling and with full responsibility, because it says it's my responsibility to act. And
but it seems to me, sorry. It seems to me that none of the discourses apply to that. It's not a university discourse. It's not a master's. You're just getting on and doing it, and somehow you're finding it. It's not. They don't seem to apply, and I'm just wondering if that is true, or if you want to say no, you're wrong, William. Do they apply at all to activity?
To activity. Does anybody want?
Maybe they're inapplicable. I'm happy to accept that answer.
I think my question might shed light on Williams as well. Yeah. I need a clarifying question first, though. Like the master talks to the slave, the analyst talks to the analyst, and the professor talks to the student. What does the hysteric talk to?
The master. Yeah.
So. But the hysteric is the other is the field of knowledge over, or sorry, it's the master signifier over the field of knowledge, but the master in the math theme is the master signifier over a barred subject with the unexpressed.
Oh, yeah,
who is the hysteric talking to? If the master is talking to the slave, for example.
Yeah. So in very concrete terms, like if you take a scientist, the M1 is the dominant scientific orthodoxy. That is just is, so physics, classical physics, and then someone like Niels Bohr or Einstein comes along, and then questions the orthodoxy, questions the kind of like the common, it could even be common sense. That kind of master signifier kind of is basically you are questioning authority. You're questioning the authority of whatever realm or region of discourse you're talking, whether it's science, politics, culture, religion. And that generates knowledge, because when you question the authority and when you force it to answer, when you force it to respond, it generates knowledge.
So this, and I think this is kind of what Williams might be saying too, is we don't always have a pure discourse. Like sometimes you're showing up wanting to take the role of the analyst, and somebody else is showing up perfectly happy being the student, or some wanting to be the hysteric. So what happens when you have those two roles, the hysteric and the analyst together? What happens to the discourse?
Yeah, and this probably is an answer to William as well. Is like I get, and this happens a lot. I think people reading Lacan is you get so caught up in these four discourses, and then you have to remind yourself, oh no, there's so many. Even if you just took those four symbols, you can rearrange them in 24 different ways, and that that, and Lacan himself did a fifth discourse called the capitalist discourse at one stage, you know, and he kind of played around with that. And so you're bringing up a good question, which is that whenever Lacan puts these four discourses down, I think he's answering a very specific question, and he's really just going. And some would say he's basically cleaning up the Oedipus complex. That's kind of how some people read the four discourses. It's a more systematic version of Freud's Oedipus. So you have the no of the father, you know, which is the separation of the mother and child. You have the name of the father, which is where you get substitutes for the mother. You can't have the mother, but you can have a teddy bear, you know, and you can cuddle a teddy bear. You can have, you know, you can have all these substitute objects for the thing. And then you have the analyst discourse, which then, you know, addresses the disappointed person who can't get the object of his desire, right? Who can't have the mother. So the analyst discourse is where the divided subject is addressed by their own desire. And then the hysterics discourse, which is, you know, where the divided subject or the dissatisfied subject has prime place. So when I read it like that, I go, oh, Lacan's just kind of like, he's kind of answering one question. He's going, what happens when language is born? What happens when the master discourse is born? And he sees three things that kind of come out of that. But yes, it doesn't cover so many ways in which we interact, and it doesn't cover how kind of like messy it all is in actual fact. But does that answer anything? Is that Kev? Is that
yeah.
And by the way, Lacan is doing this exactly because of what you're saying. Like, I think one of Lacan's issues is he thinks analysts are being too messy, right? An analysand comes to the clinic, and then they're getting advice about how to live, or they've got a paternal father figure telling them that they should, you know, split up. So I think Lacan's precisely saying what you're saying, which is it gets very messy, and Lacan's going like to the analysts, be less messy.
He's saying you need to hold your ground until the person that's there as a slave or a student for you, wanting to be that, reforms themselves into an analysand. Like, your job is just to hold this structure.
That's very well said. I think that sounds right to me. And in very practical terms, yeah, whenever I go to an analyst, some analysts talk about hystericizing the subject. So you might go to an analyst and actually you don't have any interest in encountering yourself, like you're saying. You're kind of silent. You don't say anything. You're bored. And the analyst, I think you said it beautifully, kind of in a way, has to sit with you for weeks, months, and try to cultivate within you a curiosity with your own unconscious. And that can take a long time.
And for me, I've told you this before, that I feel like there's echoes of the Jungian, of a sense of Jungian archetypes in this, like where Lacan essentially is saying, if you are speaking as if you have the field of knowledge, but you have a repressed ideology, you are the professor. That is what the role of the professor is. And that creates an archetype. Like, here's the professor archetype. You're the field of knowledge with a repressed ideology. And now in the university discourse, the professor archetype is speaking to the student. And here's what the student archetype looks like. And he's just like, I see this, I don't know if it's the shadow, but I see it like Jungian wanting to inform this a little, those Jungian archetype concepts, hoping to inform this, or like that concept of the archetype.
I mean, that is interesting. Lacan would be turning in his grave. He wouldn't, but I see what you're saying. Like as in that is true. Like Lacan's giving a completely kind of like logical structure, but by naming it, you go like, well, yeah, this is a basic form of like a, you know, which we call the master, which he calls the master. And if you wanted to call that an archetype, yeah, I could see how you could do that. Yeah.
And like, I feel in myself the tendency to want to be, like, I'm a teacher, so I feel that tendency to want to be the professor, or to want to be the master, to want to be like the one with the field of knowledge, more professor, but not recognizing like the ideology that's like, and I feel that. And a lot of the conversations that I get into, I want to step into that role. And it's almost like how do I start to learn to be the hysteric? How do I start to learn, like, to be more flexible in the role I want to fill? And that's how I'm seeing, that's the value I see in this. But that's a very Jungian thing. Like, that's almost like now we're talking about Myers-Briggs. But I don't know, is that too elementary a way to look at it? Or is the utility of this really is how to establish one of these structures, how to establish a discourse?
Yeah. Okay. You brought in now Myers-Briggs, so you brought in another thing else. I imagine as a teacher, how do, like, I'm thinking of like some of these movies as well, but I guess in some respects you're trying to some extent create hysterics. Like, so you're also teaching them, so you're doing university discourse, but also I guess with students is you're trying to instill a radical questioning so that they kind of like can
do you want to come with us?
question for themselves. Would that be right?
It's not till
Nope.
Sorry. Yeah, I that's for me with middle schoolers. So like 12 to 14. I'm very happy when they question me, because that's starting to show like that curiosity, that hysterical, like that hystericizing. But they're not happy to question me. They want me to either be the master or the professor.
Yeah.
So I see it as like hoping to plant that seed of the hysterical discourse, but it's not something that can be enacted too frequently.
Yeah. And it's funny because if they're hysterically questioning you, then it's generating knowledge, because you have to answer them. And, you know, I don't know what you're teaching or whatever, but say it's mathematics. It's like, you could probably assume certain things. And when they question you, you have to think, okay, right, what, and put it up on the blackboard. So they're generating knowledge through their questioning, you know, so, yeah. Anybody else want to jump in there?
I was kind of curious about if anyone could elaborate on, or if you could, the idea of the original no and language kind of being birthed from negation. I wonder how you'd clarify that.
Yeah, and I do know some analysts kind of make a slight, I don't know how they do it. Like, I think they call it the primal signifier and the master signifier. So I was listening to a psychoanalyst recently who said, he talked of the no not as a master signifier, as something pre that. I'm like, yeah, well, I can see that point. So but the reason why I think it's the original master signifier is because the first word can't have a meaning. It can't have a meaning until the second word comes in. It can only be a type of prohibition. And and like, if you, obviously retroactivity, which you know about, is like that only when the second and third and fourth and fifth word comes in, only whenever these other signifiers come in, does retroactively that first signifier take on a meaning. So there's this retroactivity to language. Language doesn't start at the beginning; it starts one step in, and then retroactively is basically retroactively the, well, how would you say it? The cause of itself. But yeah, but do you want to? What do you think about that, or what's your thoughts?
I can see where you're coming from, but or where psychoanalysts are coming from, but I mean, I feel like there's kind of that correlational empirical reality thing where it's like dada, you know, that's you, that's dad. This sound being emanated is a direct relation to father, even if you don't have all these other words. You know, it seems like I don't know if that makes sense.
You could say, yeah, I mean, a really interesting distinction, and one people don't make, is the distinction between communication and language. Because someone like will say, right, animals communicate, but a lot of animals don't seem to have language. And the difference, because is a sound. If a bird makes a certain sound, it means mating or it means danger. There's no signification to it. It's pure sign. It's a pure sign. Just like, so it's like computer code. Now it can be misunderstood or whatever, but language, and that's why Lacan very famously has a great example. Let me try and remember it, where he says, right, there are animals, whenever you're hunting an animal and it makes tracks, you can follow the tracks. And there are some animals that can make false tracks, right? So there's animals that make tracks, obviously. There are some animals that can make false tracks to try to put off an inexperienced hunter. But as far as we know, only humans can create true tracks that are supposed to be read as false. Right? That's where language comes in, where you're able to think, the hunter will think that I'm making false tracks. So I'm going to just keep my true tracks as a sign of false tracks.
Yeah.
And okay, go ahead.
Oh, Freud has that joke about the two men on the train with the same sort of thing. So
That's exactly it. Yeah. So if
Yeah.
where are you going? Krakow. If you're really going to Krakow, why did you say you're going to Krakow? Exactly. Yeah.
And then the Princess Bride with the wine, and
That's the ultimate signifier. Is that that's the ultimately kind of that's without a quilting point. That's that scene from the Princess Bride.
So is that fundamentally related to like the structuralist idea of differentiation, that language is only a process of difference, that there is no individual thing or like transcendental word?
That's it. That's exactly it. You know, and I think, and I only came recently to think about how fixation works. That was why I got into therapy actually years ago, is because I got a fixation. But a fixation is the stoppage of signification. Something becomes a sign, something stands in for the thing. If something is the thing, there's no longer a slip of signifiers and metaphors and one thing to the other, and your desire is flowing. Your desire stops and you hit against the sign. So like Lacan's very good at going like, well, for some people, you know, there are signs, there is a lack of signification, but at that point, that's why they say, like, in psychosis, a psychotic break, it's not really language that's going on, you know, it's something else. But does that resonate with you? Does that make sense, or do you...
Yeah, it makes more sense in terms of the difference. Yeah, I think I was making it too complicated.
It's very complicated, and I feel like I love this, working through all this, because this stuff is very messy, and I feel like it's clear, then it gets really messy, and then hopefully by the end it gets clear again. William, are you going to jump in there, or did your face just pop up for no reason?
I don't know. I know it's getting late, and I don't want to bring another thought into it. Maybe another time.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I just had a quick question. So this is a point of clarification. So Lacan brought forward kind of like these discourses to kind of explain our birth into language, but the unconscious was something else that he saw was developing its own form of language, its own like signifiers. And is it fair to say that the only way that the unconscious for Lacan can be addressed, or those slips can come out, is through the analyst discourse? There's no other way of the unconscious like showing itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know, that's brilliant. Yes. Yeah, it is funny because in a way, yeah. I mean, in a way, like the Freudian, Lacanian, and the psychoanalytic ideas that, I mean, we make Freudian slips. I've made a few the other day. I hardly ever make Freudian slips, but I made a couple the other day for some reason. And these slips, so we make Freudian slips without analysis, but with the analyst discourse is specifically makes notes and kind of like reflects back these Freudian slips. So it's like, yeah, we can definitely do a little bit of self-analysis, and maybe there's other areas of our lives where we confront ourselves, but maybe I'm a little bit too strict in this, but I sometimes am a bit down on drugs and meditation. Not that I'm against either of them for recreation or for other reasons, but there's a certain thing in which we don't encounter in a, say, doing kind of like a drug trip, is, you know, you can maybe go into some deeper kind of whatever part of yourself, but Freud's really interested in what's on the surface, in the exact Freudian slip of whenever you say your mother's name instead of your, you know, your girlfriend's name, or your father's name instead of your boyfriend's name. So the analyst discourse that's what it is about the divided subject, their desire that is expressed in the Freudian slip is in front of them and can be seen and reflected back. I think I'm just echoing what you said, or do you want to come say anything else or expand?
No, that's great. Thanks. I just needed to clarify that. Thank you.
No, it's good. I mean, that's why I don't know. Because I do think, of course, we can do this with our friends as well, and we can do it. But this is what's unique about analysis, is it's basically its only purpose. Like its only real purpose, at least for the 4 discourses, is to confront you through your slips, through your mistakes, through your your tics and your grimaces, help you encounter your own unconscious or repressed desires. Okay, we should probably kind of finish up there. I'll finish with one comment, and then and that's just when I'm using these. So we're talking about there's individuals, and Karen was bringing up how in psychoanalysis the individual confronts their own unconscious. The way I'm trying to use it with parotheology is a community that encounters the nature of their subjectivity and the nature of reality, the nature of God. So it's more like so whenever you do a decentering practice like atheism for Lent, you come to experience a fundamental fracture, something fundamental about the nature of reality. You don't encounter your own dividedness really. But at a deep level, you encounter the dividedness of reality itself, and there's something freeing about that encounter with your own individual dividedness, but actually how there's that dividedness is woven into reality itself. So I'm kind of taking this very much in a group, kind of like interpreting these in a kind of group and communal sense. So we'll see if that works. Any final thoughts? Anybody? Any final comments?
Looking forward to this year.
Thank you, and me too. See what happens. Kevin, were you going to jump in there?
I just want to jump in again and recommend that you set up another social gathering. I know it's not really your comfort zone, but I think it's really good for the community and in the area.
Okay, well, here's something then, because my mate Johnny McEwen, who is in at the end of January, and this is true, I'm not even lying to you, I could show you the text if I in the phone, is I was texting the brewery next door to go like, if my mate wanted to do a live painting session or something, would you be up for it? And they said yes. So you're encouraging me to go the next step and book that. So if that happens, that's going to be in a couple of weeks. So.
Okay, and I have 2 things that I've just been thinking about. One is, have you seen or heard about Meow Wolf? It's an interactive art museum. It started in Santa Fe, but there's one in Vegas. Whenever you're talking about transformance art, I'm kind of reminded of Meow Wolf. So next time you're in Vegas, I think you should check that out.
Okay.
And then Midnight Mass. There's a lot of resonance of what you're talking about to some themes that show up in that show. It's on Netflix.
Oh, Midnight Mass. Okay.
Yeah, I think,
good.
Yeah, I think that you would find some utility for having viewed it and making references.
Oh, I'll definitely check that out then. Thank you.
Yeah.
And did Kevin, were you going to jump in and say something, or not? The other Kevin? No. All right. Well, then we'll stop there. Thanks so much for being part of this. Thanks so much for wrestling with me on these 4 discourses. I think there's something really valuable in them, and I feel like we're working together to kind of draw that out, and I think that'll be really useful in terms of this project. So I will see you probably next week, and if you're in LA, watch out for another live social get together at the end of the month.